never thought I'd come home one day and find a huge surprise taped right to my front door. A bright, colorful flyer announcing a wedding scheduled to take place at my house. At first I thought it was some kind of prank. I stared at the flyer in disbelief, trying to make sense of the bold words printed in fancy fonts. Community wedding celebration Saturday, 3 p.m. at my address. I blinked several times, making sure I was reading it right. My house, my private property. How could the HOA schedule such a big event at my home without even asking me? For context, I've always maintained a good relationship with the HOA. Nothing special. Just the usual compliance with rules and paying fees on time. I had never once given them permission to use my property for anything. I live in a quiet neighborhood where we all respect each other's privacy. So seeing my house turned into a public venue for a wedding was baffling and frankly infuriating. I couldn't imagine the chaos this would cause. People I don't know wandering around my yard, setting up decorations, tables, maybe even a stage. The thought alone made my blood boil. Curious and alarmed, I decided to call the HOA office immediately. I was determined to find out how this could have happened without my knowledge or approval. The person on the other end of the line sounded casual, even proud, explaining that the community board had decided to organize a wedding event to bring the neighborhood closer. They went on about how this was a great opportunity for everyone to socialize and bond. But when I asked why they chose my house, the answer was vague. Something about the central location and the perfect backyard. Perfect backyard? That's my private property. I reminded them that I had not signed off on any such event, but they brushed it off as a misunderstanding. I told them no event would take place at my home without my express permission, and I expected the flyer to be taken down immediately. But later that evening, as I took out the trash, I noticed the flyers were still there, and new ones appeared on neighbors' doors too. It was as if the HOA had already committed and was just ignoring my objections. I felt powerless but knew I had to act fast before any plans went further. The next few days were stressful. I reached out to some neighbors to see if anyone else had received a flyer, or if anyone was involved in organizing this event. Most were just as confused as I was. Some even thought it was a joke. A few mentioned they'd heard rumors about the HOA planning a big surprise for the community, but no one knew it was at my house. I also began looking through my HOA agreement and local municipal laws. Something felt off. How could they simply schedule a private event on my property without consent? To make matters worse, the HOA started sending emails and posting on the neighborhood forum about the wedding event, as if it was a done deal. They posted pictures of the backyard with imaginary wedding decorations photoshopped in, asking people to RSVP. This was not only disrespectful but also legally questionable. My home is my sanctuary, and no one, not even the HOA, has the right to treat it like community property. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced around my living room, feeling both angry and helpless. I knew I had to do something beyond just yelling at the HOA office. This was a serious overstep, and I was determined to protect my rights. I started jotting down everything. The flyer details, my phone calls, emails, and any communication from the HOA. I felt like I was preparing for a battle I never wanted, but was ready to face. The next morning, I printed a formal letter to the HOA, demanding an immediate cancellation of the event and a written apology. I also hinted at possible legal action if they proceeded without my consent. It was a bold move, but I was done being ignored. My house, my rules. I reminded myself that this wasn't just about a wedding flyer. It was about standing up for my privacy and property rights. Even though the fight had just begun, I was ready. Whatever the HOA's reasons, they had crossed a line, and I was not going to let them walk all over me. The question now was, how far would they push, and how far was I willing to go to stop them? After the initial shock of finding out the HOA had scheduled a wedding at my house without my permission, I knew I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. I spent hours digging through the HOA bylaws and local municipal codes, determined to find any loophole or justification they might be using to claim control over my private property. What I discovered only fueled my frustration. There was absolutely no legal or contractual basis for them to book my home for any event. let alone a wedding. The HOA's governing documents were clear. While the association has some authority over common areas and shared facilities, private properties remained firmly under the control of their respective owners. I double-checked the sections about event approvals, use of private property, and community gatherings. Nowhere did it grant the HOA the right to schedule or host events on someone's private land without express written consent from the homeowner. This was not just a minor oversight, it was a blatant overstep. I also consulted local laws and zoning regulations. The city code was explicit about private property rights and event permits. For any event like a wedding to be held on private property, the homeowner must give permission and often a permit must be obtained. The HOA had neither consulted me nor applied for any permits. In fact, scheduling a public event without proper permits could lead to fines and legal trouble for the organizers. I felt relieved to have concrete legal ground to stand on. This wasn't just my personal boundary being crossed, it was an illegal action by the HOA. Armed with this information, I called the HOA office again, determined to confront them with facts rather than emotions. I spoke to the board president, who initially tried to dismiss my concerns by saying the wedding was a community celebration intended to promote unity and that they thought I would be okay with it. When I pointed out the legal boundaries and my rights as a homeowner, the conversation quickly became defensive on their end. They insisted it was a harmless event and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. I refused to back down. I reminded them firmly that my property rights were not up for negotiation. I told them if they went ahead with the wedding without my explicit consent, I would have no choice but to take legal action. The board president became silent for a moment and then vaguely promised to look into it. But deep down, I sensed they were hoping I would just give up and let them proceed. Not willing to leave anything to chance, I sent them a formal cease and desist letter. It stated clearly that any event scheduled on my property without my permission was unauthorized and illegal. I copied it to our neighborhood's legal advisor and the city's zoning office to show I was serious. I made it clear that proceeding with the wedding could lead to legal consequences for the HOA and any individuals involved in organizing the event. Despite all this, the HOA's communications to the community continued as if nothing had changed. Flyers were still being distributed, and the neighborhood forum buzzed with excitement about the upcoming community wedding. This blatant disregard for my rights felt like a slap in the face. I realized that they weren't just ignoring me, they were trying to steamroll me with the support of other neighbors. That's when I began to see how power dynamics play out in these HOA-controlled neighborhoods. The board seemed to believe that because they had some authority over shared spaces, they could extend their control wherever they pleased. They underestimated the strength of an individual homeowner standing up for their property rights. I felt like David facing Goliath, but I was prepared to fight tooth and nail. I also noticed some neighbors starting to whisper doubts about the HOA's decision. While a few supported the idea of a community event, many were uncomfortable with the notion of the HOA forcibly using private homes for their agenda. This gave me hope that I wasn't alone, that the community might back me up once they understood the legality and ethics involved. In the meantime, I kept documenting everything: the emails, the flyers, the conversations. I wanted a solid record, in case I had to take this all the way to court. I was prepared to hire a lawyer if necessary. My property was my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let anyone, even the HOA, treat it as their playground. The situation was tense, and I knew it. It could escalate quickly, but I wasn't about to let the HOA's illegal overreach go unanswered. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about setting a precedent for respect, boundaries, and legal rights in a community that should support its residents, not trample on them. I braced myself for the next move, knowing the fight was far from over. After realizing just how serious the HOA's illegal plans were, I knew I couldn't handle this battle alone. The next step was to rally support, gather allies, and build a solid case that would back me up both legally and socially. If the HOA was going to push through with scheduling a wedding on my property without my permission, I had to make sure I had the community and the law on my side. I started by knocking on neighbors' doors, explaining the situation calmly and clearly. Many were surprised to hear what the HOA was up to, especially because the flyers had been going around for a while without anyone really questioning them. A lot of folks assumed the HOA had the right to do this or simply didn't think it was a big deal. But when I laid out the facts, the lack of permission, the legal issues, the disrespect of private property, people's attitudes began to shift. Some neighbors expressed frustration with the HOA's heavy-handed approach. They felt blindsided too, and a few admitted they hadn't realized how much power the HOA wielded without proper oversight. Others were cautious, worried about causing conflict in the community, or feared reprisals from the HOA board. Still, several of my neighbors became my strongest supporters. They offered to speak out at the next HOA meeting and even volunteered to help me document the situation. While gathering neighborhood support, I also reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property and HOA disputes. During our first consultation, the lawyer confirmed my suspicions that the HOA's actions were illegal and could be challenged in court. We discussed sending a more formal legal notice and preparing for potential mediation if the HOA refused to back down. It was reassuring to have professional validation that I was on solid ground. The lawyer also helped me understand how important it was to keep detailed records of everything: flyers, emails, conversations, and even photos of any preparations the HOA might begin without my consent. I started keeping a dedicated file, noting every interaction and every piece of evidence that could prove the HOA had no right to schedule this wedding on my property. I even took pictures of flyers posted around the neighborhood and screenshots of online posts promoting the event. The more I documented, the clearer it became that the HOA was ignoring multiple legal boundaries. I shared my evidence with my neighbors, and we started organizing to present a united front. We drafted a petition demanding the immediate cancellation of the wedding and reaffirming homeowners' rights to control their private property. The petition gained dozens of signatures within days, showing that many residents were uncomfortable with the HOA's overreach. However, the HOA board wasn't silent. I received a few cold emails reminding me that the board had the community's best interests in mind and that this event was approved by majority vote during a previous meeting. I knew better. No such vote had ever included or informed me, and even if it had, they had no authority to use my property without my consent. I remained firm in my stance, communicating through formal letters and involving the lawyer when necessary. Tensions grew as the date of the wedding approached. I noticed signs of preparation starting on my property. Some stakes in the ground where they apparently planned to set up tents, and some vendors scouting the yard. I immediately took photos and sent a cease and desist email, demanding the removal of any unauthorized equipment. I made it clear that any attempts to proceed without my permission would be met with legal action. While the HOA tried to paint me as the bad guy for opposing a community event, I felt more empowered than ever. I realized that standing up for my property rights wasn't just about me. It was about protecting the entire neighborhood from unchecked HOA power. I even reached out to a local news reporter who showed interest in the story. If public pressure increased, the HOA might think twice before ignoring homeowners' rights again. Through this process, I learned a lot about the complicated relationship between HOAs and homeowners. Sometimes the boards forget they are meant to serve the community, not control it. I also saw how important it was to have allies, both neighbors and professionals, who understand the stakes and are willing to stand with you. The battle wasn't over yet, but I felt ready. I had built a network of support, gathered concrete evidence, and armed myself with legal advice. The next steps would be critical. The HOA could try to push forward anyway, or maybe, just maybe, they would finally listen. Either way, I was prepared to fight for my home, my rights, and my peace as the wedding date drew nearer. The tension between me and the HOA escalated to an almost unbearable level. Despite my warnings, legal notices, and community pushback, the HOA stubbornly pressed forward with their plans. I kept seeing signs of their preparations: stakes driven into the ground, rented chairs being delivered, and even floral arrangements mysteriously appearing near my property line. It felt like they were daring me to stop them, confident I wouldn't take drastic action. But at that point I realized subtle warnings weren't enough. I needed to make a bold statement that could not be ignored. I considered my options carefully. Calling the police or seeking a court injunction might have slowed them down, but I knew legal processes take time, and the wedding was imminent. I needed something immediate and unmistakable to assert my control over my property. That's when a wild idea took shape, something dramatic, something to send a clear message to the HOA and the entire neighborhood. They had no right to treat my home like a public venue. I decided to hire a demolition crew, not to damage my house, but to tear down any illegal wedding setups the HOA tried to install on my property. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. Demolition implies destruction, chaos, and expense. But this was about defending my rights in the strongest way possible. I reached out to a trusted local demolition company I'd worked with before on a small renovation project and explained the situation. They understood immediately. This was less about wrecking property and more about protecting it. We agreed that their job would be strictly limited to dismantling any unauthorized structures, tents, stages, chairs, and decorative setups that the HOA illegally erected. With the demolition crew on standby, I started monitoring my property around the clock. I stayed in constant contact with neighbors, some of whom volunteered to help keep watch during the nights leading up to the wedding. The HOA was clearly caught off guard by my level of resistance, but they continued sending out messages encouraging people to attend the event, oblivious to how far I was willing to go. Then the big day arrived. Early in the morning, I woke up to the sound of trucks pulling up to my driveway. The demolition crew was ready. Almost immediately, they spotted workers and vendors trying to assemble tents and set up chairs without any permission. I gave the go-ahead, and within hours the demolition team began tearing down the partially assembled wedding structures. They dismantled the tents, folded up chairs, and removed floral arrangements that had been strewn about. They moved quickly, professionally and legally, destroying only what was unauthorized and leaving my home and yard intact. The neighbors gathered to watch, many whispering in shock and admiration. Some even cheered quietly, relieved that someone was finally standing up to the HOA's ridiculous overreach. Word spread fast through the community forum and local social media. The HOA board was furious, but they couldn't deny what had happened. Their illegal wedding setup was demolished on private property, and there was nothing they could do about it. I received several angry calls from HOA officials demanding I stop the demolition and accusing me of escalating the conflict. But I stood my ground, explaining that this was a direct response to their illegal actions. I had given multiple warnings, legal notices, and had even tried to resolve things peacefully. The HOA had ignored all of it. This was my last resort, and a powerful reminder that my home was mine alone. In the days that followed, the HOA quietly canceled the wedding event. They never publicly admitted wrongdoing, but their silence spoke volumes. The neighborhood began to question the board's authority and methods, sparking discussions about limits to HOA power and respect for homeowners' rights. Some neighbors who had been on the fence before now openly supported me, recognizing the importance of standing up against bullying tactics. Reflecting on everything, I realized how important it was to assert myself decisively. Had I backed down or been passive, the HOA would have continued pushing boundaries, potentially scheduling more events or making decisions that directly affected my property without my consent. The demolition stunt wasn't just about a wedding, it was about protecting my home, my privacy, and my freedom. While I hoped it wouldn't come to such extremes in the future, I felt ready to take any necessary measures to defend what was mine. The experience taught me a lot about power, boundaries, and standing firm in the face of intimidation. It also reminded me that sometimes the strongest message isn't a quiet complaint, it's bold, visible action that forces respect. With the illegal wedding plans destroyed and the HOA forced to back off, I finally felt peace return to my home. But I knew the battle had changed the neighborhood forever, and that my story would serve as a warning to anyone thinking of overstepping their authority again. After the demolition crew tore down the unauthorized wedding setup, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. The HOA, which had seemed so confident and unchallenged before, suddenly found itself on the defensive. Word spread quickly, both among residents and the board members, that I wasn't someone to be pushed around, and that my rights as a homeowner would be fiercely protected. In the days that followed, the HOA quietly canceled the wedding, and the flyers disappeared almost overnight. There was no official